The old farmhouse was quiet most nights, its wooden floors creaking only when the wind swept past the surrounding fields. On one of these nights, Mark sat in the living room, staring at a family photograph. In it, he balanced a beaming infant in his arms, Emily, his daughter, while his wife Lillian stood beside him, radiant in the soft light. Lillian had passed away 3 years ago, a harrowing moment that carved a void in both Mark's life and his daughter. The air in the house felt perpetually stale after her death, and every step Mark took seemed accompanied by a chorus of guilty memories he couldn't shake off. At first, Emily was a bright little girl who refused to let sorrow swallow her. She remained cheerful, or at least Mark thought so. He only slowly began to notice something was wrong when her laughter turned to whimpers, and she began to cling to him whenever night fell. He chalked it up to nightmares, but the more he soothed her, the more uneasy he became. She always seemed on edge, as though she could sense a threat that he couldn't see. Mark tried to be both mother and father to Emily, but the strain was slowly spoiling his ability to reassure her. One particularly stormy evening, Mark tucked Emily into bed. The scent of lavender from her pajama set mixed oddly with the musty smell of their old home. Thunder rattled the windows. She looked at him with wide eyes and whispered, "Don't leave the door open." This was new. She used to want the door wide open so that the faint glow from the hallway lamp would pour in. Yet tonight, she was terrified of that light. Mark usually asked if she wanted a bedtime story, but something in her trembling tone told him not to question her. He quietly shut the door so it was almost closed. He was halfway down the hall when he heard the first scream. It pierced the silence so violently that he dropped his mug of tea, splashing scalding liquid onto his slippers. He rushed back to Emily's door, nearly tearing it from its hinges as he yanked it open. What he saw before him was a vision that would replay in his nightmares for weeks. Emily sat upright, her eyes filled with dread, staring at the rocking chair across the room. It was swaying by itself, as though invisible hands were pushing it. There was no gust of wind, no rational explanation. The chair rocked more urgently until it clattered onto its side with a violent thud. Mark scooped Emily into his arms, her small hands gripping his shirt so tightly he felt her nails dig into his skin. She was gasping between sobs. The rocking chair lay on the floor, still trembling as if it had a life of its own. With trembling steps, Mark carried her back to the hallway, scanning for intruders, but there was no sign of anyone else. Heart pounding, he glanced one final time at the abandoned chair, and though the storm winds rattled the windows, inside the room, it was dead still. He tried dedicating the next day to rationalize the supernatural swirl of events. Maybe the wind had blown the chair over. Perhaps it had been precariously balanced. He told himself all sorts of stories, though none felt satisfying. All day, Emily followed him around, refusing to let him leave her sight for more than a minute. As he prepared dinner, he noticed that she chose to sit in a corner of the kitchen. She appeared to be avoiding the dining table as though it dripped with menace. When the power briefly flickered in the late afternoon, she scrambled to his side, eyes darting nervously at the chandelier overhead. Since Lillian's death, Emily had never been this anxious. Mark couldn't shake off the memory of her scream or the chair flipping onto its side, both events entangled as if they were cause and effect. Later that week, he decided they both needed to get away from the old house, so he took Emily to the local fair, a short drive from the farm. While bright lights spun overhead and crowds meandered among cotton candy stands, Mark hoped the joyous atmosphere might loosen the knots in Emily's mind. At first, she seemed to enjoy the loud, colorful chaos. She even managed to laugh when she threw a beanbag at some wobbly clown targets. But as the afternoon dragged on and the crowds thickened, Emily's face grew paler, and she pressed closer to Mark. A commotion erupted nearby. Someone dropped a large fireworks box, sending a handful of bright, crackling sparks into the air. The abrupt noise caught Emily off guard, and she screamed. Instantly, a row of plastic chairs at a nearby refreshment stall rattled and clattered together as if shoved by a gale. Gasps rippled through the small group of carnival goers who witnessed the incident, though no one quite knew what had happened. Grasping Emily's shaking hand, Mark led her to the car as discreetly as possible. The entire drive home, his heart hammered in his rib cage. Could it be that her screams actually caused objects to move? Mark knew it sounded insane. He imagined telling a friend, "My daughter can move things with her fear." He would be laughed at or worse, accused of delusions. Too disturbed to sleep that night, he paced the house, replaying every detail of that day. His eyes kept returning to the door of Emily's bedroom, a place now charged with an almost oppressive sense of the unknown. Emily's next incident took place at school. Mark received an urgent call from the principal's office around noon. He rushed there, driving well over the speed limit. When he arrived, he found Emily trembling in the counselor's room, while an overturned bookshelf lay strewn in the corridor. Miss Morgan, a stern-faced teacher, said that during lunch a balloon unexpectedly popped near Emily, causing her to shriek. Seconds later, a heavy bookshelf, a piece of furniture that had once looked immovable, toppled over, scattering textbooks everywhere. Witnesses swore they hadn't seen anyone push it. Miss Morgan's tone was equal parts baffled and accusatory, as though Emily had broken the laws of gravity on purpose. Mark felt paralyzed by his own mixture of concern, shame, and guilt. He collected Emily and took her home. That same evening, Mark typed out frantic searches on his laptop. Telekinesis triggered by fear. Objects moving when children scream. Psychic phenomenon or illusions. Child telepathy or supernatural. He didn't know what he was doing or even what he was hoping to find. There was zero comfort in the tangled web of bizarre stories and fringe theories that turned up. In chat rooms dedicated to the paranormal, strangers argued in heated threads about whether telekinetic ability existed at all. Some claimed it was a manifestation of trauma. Others insisted it was demonic possession. None of it felt real. Yet reality was all Mark had to work with. He'd seen the results with his own eyes. The rocking chair. The carnival chairs. The shelf. Each time, the trigger was Emily's terror. That night, Mark cradled his coffee mug and watched Emily from across the living room. She was curled on the sofa, a blanket drawn up to her chin, eyes fixed on the television playing some cartoon. The cartoon's bright colors did little to mask her trembling. She looked tired beyond her years. Mark felt a pang of guilt, so sharp it nearly made him weep. Perhaps he'd failed to provide the security she needed after her mother's passing, and all this fear was the symptom. But was that fair? Could emotional neglect explain telekinesis? A voice in Mark's head hissed that this could be his fault, that he might have overlooked signals of Emily's fear until it erupted into frightening, unexplainable power. Later, he dreamt of Lillian for the first time in months. In the dream, she sat in Emily's rocking chair, beckoning him closer. "She's different, Mark," she whispered. "Don't make her afraid. You need to protect her." When he approached, the chair toppled over, tangled in a swirl of lightning and laughter. He jolted awake, the memory coated in sweat. Emily was still asleep in her own bedroom. He rushed to check on her, half expecting to see a whirlwind of floating objects. But she lay peacefully in bed, though even in the throes of sleep, she gripped the edges of her blanket in clenched fists. Desperate for answers, Mark made an appointment with a child psychologist named Dr. Milton. Located in a gray, nondescript building, the psychologist operated out of a small, tidy office with motivational posters on the walls. Mark laid out Emily's bizarre behavior as discreetly as possible, although he omitted the more terrifying details of objects flying. Dr. Milton listened intently, tapping a pen to her notepad, her face neutral. She suggested Emily might be suffering from extreme anxiety, possibly post-traumatic stress from her mother's death, and recommended therapy sessions that used techniques like art expression. Mark left the office feeling deflated. He knew Dr. Milton was working with the standard clinical framework, but nothing she offered came close to addressing tables flipping or chairs rocking on their own. Still, Mark took Emily to the sessions, hoping to ease her anxiety if nothing else. After a few weeks there was no improvement. Truthfully, Emily seemed more drained. All she would draw were swirling lines, black scribbles, and sometimes a lone figure standing at the edge of a page. The figure was usually overshadowed by a giant mass of darkness. When Dr. Milton asked gently, "Is that you?" Emily would shrug and hide behind Mark. One warm afternoon, Mark decided that a more direct approach might be necessary. He wanted to confront these episodes head-on. He told himself he'd remain calm no matter what happened. After Emily finished her dinner, he carried her to the living room and switched off the lights. Only a faint glow from a street lamp outside illuminated the walls. Emily's breath quickened, and she looked around, frightened. "Daddy, why is it dark?" she asked. "I'm here," he said gently, pulling her onto his lap on the couch. He wanted to see if he could control her environment, keep her calm, but it didn't work. She became more fearful by the second. Seeing her in distress, he realized immediately that what he was doing felt cruel. Yet a voice in the back of his mind insisted he had to confirm the cause and effect pattern. A passing car honked loudly, echoing through the house like a gunshot. Emily let out a scream, and the table lamp on the far end of the room slid off its stand, shattering on the floor. Mark winced, guilt igniting in his chest. He consoled her as best he could, feeling monstrous for coaxing out her terror. That was the last time he intentionally tried to trigger her fear. In the aftermath, father and daughter quietly cleaned up the shards of broken lamp. Emily lingered close, unable to banish the quiver in her voice. "I'm sorry," she said at last, tears finding their way down her cheeks. "I broke the lamp." Mark's heart ached. The poor girl blamed herself, even though she had no control over this wild force. He wanted to hold her close and promise her that none of it was her fault. Instead, he muttered, "It's all right, sweetie," and gathered her in a trembling embrace. His own guilt festered beneath the surface. He hated himself for testing her like a lab rat, but the truth had become undeniable. Her terror had a direct correlation with the telekinetic phenomena. One sleepless night turned into many. Mark found himself terrified to be around his own daughter, not because Emily was dangerous, but because his every misstep might spark her next episode. He tiptoed around the house, trying not to shout, not to allow any sudden noises to startle her. He unplugged the clanging grandfather clock to keep it from chiming at midnight. He took to cooking only quiet meals, avoiding any loud collisions of pots and pans. Yet the house felt steeped in a stifling tension, the tension of constantly avoiding triggers. Despite his best efforts, accidents happened. A sudden thunderclap during a storm made Emily shriek, sending a stack of dishes flying off the kitchen counter. She recoiled, staring at the shards of porcelain with such horror that Mark feared she'd hurt herself. Another time, a dog barking outside triggered her fear in the middle of the night, causing her window to slam shut on its own. It was as if their entire world had turned into a precarious labyrinth of potential triggers. As the weeks dragged on, Mark could barely look at Emily without feeling his gut twist in remorse. He remembered his vow to protect her. What kind of father was he if he couldn't help her through this? He spent hours poring over online forums about experimental therapies, reading stories of those who claimed certain hypnosis techniques or meditation might help children with extraordinary abilities. But each method seemed more far-fetched than the last. He spoke to a priest who advised prayer and a calming presence, reminding Mark that love was stronger than any fear. Mark walked away without conviction, but with a seed of desperate hope. If nothing else, his love for Emily had to be unwavering. Then, reality struck a more brutal chord. The school principal notified Mark that the repeated incidents had caused alarm among teachers and parents. They asked that Emily take a leave of absence. Indefinite leave. Though framed politely, the subtext was clear. The school saw her as a safety risk. Mark's despair mounted. He wanted to shout at them that it wasn't Emily's fault, that they were effectively ostracizing a little girl who needed help. But what could he do? There were no illusions left. Everyone believed something was off with Emily, whether they called it extreme anxiety, temper tantrums, or psychological issues. No one wanted her around their children. One evening, Mark was awakened by the sound of muffled crying. He found Emily standing in the hallway at the foot of the stairs, lit only by the flickering of the overhead lamp. She was shaking, tears streaming down her cheeks in silent tremors. Concerned, he knelt beside her. "What's wrong?" he asked. She looked up with hollow eyes. "I'm scared, Daddy," she said. "I see shadows." Mark glanced around, spotting only the shifting silhouettes cast by the overhead bulb. His heart twisted at the thought of Emily battling internal phantoms he had helped to conjure. "Let's go to your room," he murmured. Her small hand in his was clammy. Once they were in her bedroom, he pulled back the covers and urged her to climb in. She hesitated, scanning the corners of the room as though expecting an invisible intruder to leap out. Gently, he guided her under the blankets, sat on the edge of the bed, and smoothed back her hair. He considered telling her a story, the way Lillian had, but no words came to him that felt adequate. Instead, he stayed by her side until her breathing steadied. At around midnight, Emily finally drifted off, her eyelashes still tinted with tears. Mark watched her in the faint glow from the lamp in the hallway. His memories of Lillian felt sharp as shards of glass tonight, thrashing about in his head, telling him he had failed them both. She had wanted Emily's life to be filled with wonder, not crippling terror. Guilt cut at him from all sides, yet he knew he had to push forward. He had to find a way for Emily to overcome her terror, or at least channel it. But how? In a moment of clarity that same night, Mark recalled the priest's words that love was stronger than fear. It was a cliché, but something in that simplicity lit a flame in his chest. Maybe it was less about controlling her environment and more about teaching Emily that fear did not control her. He needed to find a way to help her see that the horrors she envisioned were not absolute. If these telekinetic outbursts were triggered by terror, then perhaps reversing fear might calm the phenomenon. He had to build her courage, not just shield her from triggers. The following morning, he woke Emily earlier than usual. They ate breakfast together in relative silence, the clatter of silverware minimal. Her eyes were still wary. Mark gathered a small bag of snacks and told her they were going on a trip. As they rode in the car, farmland gave way to rolling hills, and eventually a stream glinted in the rising sun. The place he had in mind was a meadow near a shallow creek, one he and Lillian had once visited. It was secluded, quiet, and bathed in natural light. If anywhere could dispel the fear in Emily, maybe it was this gentle spot of earth. They arrived mid-morning. The grasses were tall and softly rustled in the breeze, while the creek babbled over smooth stones. Emily looked uncertain, but her posture wasn't as tense as it was at home. Out here, the house's oppressive walls couldn't loom over her. Mark stretched out an old blanket on the grass, and they sat down side by side. She nibbled on a sandwich while Mark recounted a funny memory of Lillian trying, and failing, to catch tadpoles in that same creek. A small smile flickered at the corners of Emily's mouth. He encouraged her to dip her legs in the water. She wriggled her toes in the chilly stream, letting out a squeal, but it wasn't a fearful one. It was excitement. Mark reaffirmed every small act of bravery. That's great, Emily. You're stronger than you think." As the hours passed, he saw life gradually return to her eyes. She'd trail her fingers across the water's surface. She'd toss pebbles. She even giggled at petty jokes he made. Late in the afternoon, the sun hung low, casting golden rays across the meadow. Emily was rummaging through the picnic basket when a bullfrog startled her. It bounded near her feet, letting out a guttural croak. She almost screamed. But then she composed herself. She stepped back, trembling, but no objects flew, no ground shook. She steadied her own breath. Mark rushed toward her, but she held up her palm as if to say, "I can do this." For a long, victorious minute they stood there in silence, father and daughter, letting her self-control sink in. A wave of gratitude and relief washed through Mark. She could handle fear without letting it devour her. They drove back to the farmhouse under a sky tinged with purples and pinks, the horizon like a comforting quilt. Mark could sense that something fundamental had shifted in Emily. She seemed exhausted but calmer, as though she had discovered a small island of peace within herself. When they finally reached the house, he expected the old building's foreboding presence to undo all that progress. Yet as she stepped inside, Emily gave the hallway a cursory glance and went straight to her room without the usual hesitation. A few minutes later, he heard her humming. 3 nights passed without incident. Mark allowed himself a glimmer of hope. He found Emily in better spirits, sometimes even returning to old hobbies like coloring pictures that weren't cloaked in darkness. Occasionally, he'd hear her whispering to her stuffed animals at bedtime, as though giving them pep talks. She still jumped at the force of a slammed door or a dropped object, but she trembled less. Little by little, the padlocked vault of tension in the house cracked open, letting a whisper of normalcy seep through. On the fourth night, however, Mark had a gruesome nightmare. He saw Emily wandering alone in the house. Every time she looked at an object, a chair, a table, a lamp, it rose into the air, swirling around her. She was crying for Mark, but somehow he couldn't move, couldn't speak. Then a bass-like drum beat echoed through his dream, causing everything to collapse on Emily at once. He woke, doused in sweat, uncertain if he'd shouted in his sleep. He lunged for Emily's bedroom, but she was sleeping soundly. Still, the memory of that dream refused to fade, a harsh reminder that things might still go wrong. The next morning, Mark quietly brewed coffee in the kitchen, hoping Emily would join him as usual. He was startled to see her walk in, already dressed, with a determined expression. "I'm not going to be afraid anymore," she declared. He set down his mug and glanced at her bright eyes. That's wonderful, sweetheart," he replied, cautious but optimistic. Her test came sooner than expected. That afternoon, a neighbor's dog ran loose in their yard, barking hysterically at a passing truck. The sudden racket made Emily stiffen. Mark tensed, bracing for her to scream. Instead, she closed her eyes and took a deep breath, a choice that felt bigger than it looked. The barking continued, but when she opened her eyes, there was no telekinetic storm swirling around them. The dog eventually trotted away, and she resumed coloring on the front porch. By evening, Emily was curled up on the couch, drifting into a calm sleep. Mark carried her to her bed, feeling a profound sense of gratitude. Still, he remained vigilant, his paternal instincts on guard, as though the next storm might strike at any moment. In the middle of the night, a thunderous rumble jolted him from half-sleep. Another storm was rolling in. Sheets of rain pounded the windows, lightning slicing the sky. He waited, listening for Emily's scream. When it came, it was so sudden and sharp that his heart seized in his chest. Lightning flashed, revealing his daughter standing in the hallway, trembling like a leaf. Mark rushed to her side. Her sobs came in ragged gasps. She was petrified of storms, and this one was fierce. She choked on her words. "Daddy, I'm so scared." He pulled her against his chest, murmuring reassurances. The windows rattled under the assault of wind and rain. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for something to fly across the hallway in that terrifying pattern they had experienced before. Mark felt every muscle in her body tense. A faint hum in the air made his pulse skyrocket. Lightning exploded outside, and Emily screamed again, a raw, piercing cry. Cracks echoed. Mark spun around. The hallway mirror quivered on its nail. He saw his own terrified face reflected there. Tiny fissures radiated outward like malicious spiderwebs across the mirror's surface. In the hush between claps of thunder, a single large shard broke off and dropped to the floor with a chilling clang. Emily pressed her face into Mark's shoulder, tears streaming onto his shirt. The mirror abruptly stilled. The rest of its fractured pieces stayed put, precariously held together. Nothing else moved. Heart pounding, Mark gently pulled Emily away. "Open your eyes, sweetie," he whispered. She blinked, eyes red from crying. She looked at the cracked mirror, at the piece on the floor, then at him. The storm raged on outside, thunder bellowing overhead, but the mirror didn't plunge to the ground, and no other furniture shifted. She'd managed to halt the outburst from escalating beyond that single break. Mark felt a strange mixture of relief and sorrow swirl in him. He stared at the fractured reflection in the mirror. Father and daughter, bonded in adversity. The difference was that now, Emily displayed an ability to stop the chaos midstream. It wasn't perfect, but it was an invaluable step forward. Exhausted, Mark guided her back to bed. He stayed by her side as the storm continued to rage. Rain pelted the roof for what felt like hours. He whispered reassuring stories of simpler times, describing the meadow they had visited until her breathing steadied. She clutched his hand tightly, eventually succumbing to sleep. He wondered if what she needed most was the belief that someone would be there, that she wouldn't have to stand alone against her nightmares. Lillian was gone and he had to wear both hats, protector and nurturer. When morning light finally peered through the window, Mark awoke with Emily still holding his hand. She stirred, yawned, and gave him a searching look. "Is it over?" she asked softly. Her question seemed bigger than just the storm. He offered a small smile. "The storm is over, yes," he said, "and we're okay." She nodded with relief, as though deciding to trust those words. Outside, the air was fresh, dew glistening on the grass like tiny jewels. The house carried the usual morning hush, broken only by the soft gurgle of the coffee machine and the faint cracks in the hallway mirror that told their story. Though the fear still lingered just beneath Emily's surface, something else shone brighter in her eyes now. An ember of resolve. Mark's guilt pulsed quietly in the background, reminding him of all the ways he might have failed her. And yet, seeing her small shoulders no longer hunched in dread, he felt a kind of hesitant pride. They weren't out of the woods completely. Telekinesis born of terror didn't just disappear overnight. There would be more storms, literal and metaphorical. But, at least for this morning, father and daughter stood united against the shadows that loomed in corners, determined that fear would never again hold all the power.